Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The shocking execution and fall of Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector. Following the death of Henry VIII, his son, despite being just a young boy and having older half-sisters, came onto the throne. The reign of King Edward VI was supposed to be a long one in which the boy king would grow up and have many children that would succeed him and carry on the Tudor dynasty for centuries to come. But this did not happen, as the king died at a young age after being on the throne for just a small number of years. But as he was a young boy, he was not allowed to rule on his own, and Henry VIII established a regency council to rule on behalf of his son until he became of age. But there was one man on that council of advisers that became the most powerful, and was declared the Lord Protector of England. With this he virtually became the ruler of the country, and Edward Seymour the King's uncle was incredibly powerful. However, he ultimately had a spectacular fall from grace and was overthrown and dragged to Tower Hill, where he was beheaded in front of a huge crowd. But what caused his downfall and subsequent execution? Under Henry VIII, Edward Seymour was rather powerful. He was the Earl of Hertford and was the brother to the king's third wife, Jane Seymour, the woman who gave Henry VIII the son he greatly wanted. Whilst the king was away, Edward Seymour was involved in managing London, and he was in 1542 appointed to the position of the Warden of the Scottish Marshes and later Lord High Admiral. He was then, in the March of 1544, made the Lieutenant General of the North and was told by Henry to punish the Scots for their opposition to Prince Edward being betrothed to the infant Queen of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots. When he landed in Leith, he captured and pillaged Edinburgh and caused great devastation along the way, burning lots of villages, settlements and castles, and his army killed thousands in the conflict known as the War of the Rough Wooing. It was the most devastating attack on Scotland for centuries, and he was a very feared military commander. Seymour was also placed in control of armies in Europe, and he then returned to cause more chaos in Scotland. It was said he sent forth a good band to the number of 15,000 light horsemen, which from 5 a.m. till 3 p.m. forayed along the waters 6 or 7 miles beyond Jedburgh, and burnt 14 of 15 towns and a great quantity of all kinds of corn. In the final days of Henry VIII's reign, Edward Seymour was regularly in meetings with the king about who would become the main power behind the throne following his death. Political, personal and religious rivalries separated the many people who wished to become the Lord Protector. But following Henry VIII's death, Seymour's nephew Edward became the king. Henry VIII's will dictated that 16 executors were to act as Edward's counsel until he became 18, and these executors, also helped by another 12 men who could be called upon. Lavish handouts of titles and lands occurred after Henry's death, and Seymour became the Lord Protector of the realm and also the Duke of Somerset. Henry's will did not state there needed to be a protector, but the executors chose to instate regal power in Edward Seymour, practically making him the de facto ruler in England whilst the king was a young boy. Seymour's takeover of power was quick, and it was reported that he governs everything absolutely. And despite having secretaries, he did have some rivalry in his position. One of his biggest rivals was his brother Thomas Seymour, who was hell-bent on power, and he even married Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's widow. Thomas Seymour would spread rumours and deceit against Edward, and ultimately conspire to abduct and kidnap the young boy king, and because of this he was imprisoned at the Tower of London. Edward Seymour then even signed the death warrant of his own brother, who was then executed on Tower Hill. But Seymour, in his power, was practically ruling over the council, and he dismissed the heresy laws and the treason laws that had passed, and he tried to win over the Scots with promises of self-rule, free trade and privileges. But the Scots were not happy. Because of this, Edward Seymour led another army into Scotland. He tried to influence religion also, and tried to bring uniformity, and introduced a Book of Common Prayer, which was brought into all churches. Edward Seymour was a skilled soldier, and he established further garrisons in Scotland. but the cost of maintaining these north of the border placed strain on the royal finances and the crown. But during 1548, things were not going well in England, and there was a significant amount of unrest. Armed revolts broke out and caused by rebellious anger, and the two serious rebellions were put down in Devon and Cornwall and Norfolk. The years of 1548 and 1549 were devastating for Edward Seymour with the rebellion, and this led to him being a figure of ridicule and hatred across the country. Kett's rebellion broke out in Norfolk in the July of 1549, and Kett was a large landowner who believed it was wrong to enclose common land, and he agreed to help protesters. He became the leader, and his rebellion grew quickly to where 16,000 people were camped outside Norwich. He came up with demands, and his rebellion was incredibly important, and it almost caused a class war. He formed a council made up of representatives, and the self-government was a huge problem for Seymour. Seymour said that the rebels would be pardoned if they returned to their homes, and he did mention that force would be used if they refused. The mayor refused to allow Kett's army into the city, but armed with swords, spears and weapons, they stormed the walls of the city. 1,400 men from the government were sent to deal with this, but they were defeated and were forced to flee. Edward Seymour then sent the Earl of Warwick and 13,000 soldiers to deal with this. Kett was then forced to give up the city. Despite doing well in putting the rebellion down, Edward Seymour did get significant criticism for the problems across the country. Someone wrote to him saying, "Every man of the council have misliked your proceedings. Would to God that at the first stir you had followed the matter hotly, and caused justice to be misinterred in solemn fashion to the terror of others." Ultimately, much of the anger involved ownership of land, and what led to Seymour's fall has often been referred to as a coup d'etat. By the 1st of October 1549, Seymour knew his position was in danger, and he asked for help. He took possessions of the king and withdrew to Windsor Castle. The council at this time published detailed writings on how Seymour has mishandled the government and how he had made a mess of the country. They said that the Protector's power came from the council and not the will of Henry VIII, and they took swift action. On the 11th of October, Edward Seymour was arrested and then brought to the king at Richmond. King Edward stated that the charges against his uncle, saying that he was accused of ambition, vainglory, entering into rash wars in mine youth, negligent looking on New Haven, enriching himself of my treasure, following his own opinion, and doing all by his own authority. He was in a hopeless situation, and he was forced to give over the position of Lord Protector, and was officially deposed in an Act of Parliament on the 14th of January 1550. He was deprived of his other possessions and his land, and was sent to the Tower of London. He was housed as a prisoner until he was released by the Earl of Warwick, and was then restored back to the council. But in the October of 1551, he was arrested again and sent back to the Tower of London accused of treason. Edward Seymour, yet again, was accused of more crimes, including planning to imprison and murder the Earl of Warwick and 2 councillors, but he was found guilty and was then sentenced to death. The day before his execution, he wrote his final thoughts, saying, "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Put thy trust in the Lord with all thine heart." Being found in the small box, he then signed it off with, "From the Tower the day before my death." On the morning of the 22nd of January 1552, Edward Seymour was awoken from his cell in the Tower of London at 8 a.m. He was taken on the short walk out of the Tower of London's walls up to the Tower Hill, which was known as the public beheading spot. It was here where important Tudor figures such as Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More were beheaded, and Tower Hill was also where his brother Thomas Seymour had had his head struck clean off. A scaffold was there in the place for the execution, and Edward Seymour was praying for a royal pardon, but there would not be one that came. He climbed the steps of the scaffold and knelt and gave himself over to God. He spoke to the large crowd who were there to see the proceedings, and thousands were there to see the execution of the most powerful man in the country. Seymour made a speech, and he said how he had been condemned to die by law, and that he accepted this but still believed he had committed no wrong. He said he took comfort from God and how he had been given time to pray and be at one with God during his imprisonment. But as he finished speaking, a huge noise was heard in the crowd. People ran in a frenzy in all directions and some hid in ditches. It was caused by the loud trampling of feet from a number of guards who had arrived late at the execution, and they rushed to the front with their spears and halberds. Seymour must have thought this was a last-minute reprieve from the king, but it was not the case. He held his cap in one hand and continued to speak, saying, "For albeit the spirit be willing and ready, the flesh is frail and wavering, and through your quietness I shall be much more the quieter." He hoped it would be one quick strike from the axe that would end his life, and then he knelt in the straw where the block had been placed. He read a confession to God and took the hand of the man on the scaffold and gave the executioner several gold rings to dispatch him quickly. He took off his gown in a calm state, and then knelt on the block and untied the strings on his shirt collar. The executioner helped him to do this and gave him a handkerchief to tie round his eyes. He then raised his hands to God and put his head on the block. He didn't seem to be too fearful, and then the executioner asked him to remove his doublet. This is because he was having a difficulty finding where to aim the axe. Seymour then placed his head on the block again and said, "O Lord Jesus, preserve me," and in one fast and clean stroke of the axe, the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, was killed and executed. His body and head were placed in a wooden chest and taken into the Tower of London, and the crowd rushed forwards to touch his blood and preserve it on their handkerchiefs. Edward Seymour was ruling England for the king, King Edward VI, for a number of years in his minority, and he was the most powerful man in the land and was a feared military leader. But his legacy was one which was of great social unrest, and many across the country did not like the changes he brought to society and religion. But like his brother, he lost his head on Tower Hill in a very bloody scene. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.